It is my pleasure to introduce the next moderator, Elora Shehabuddin, who is also chairing today's conference. Elora is Assistant Professor of Humanities and Political Science at Rice University. Elora, where are you? Okay.
Thank you all for coming, and despite a very nice and heavy lunch. Before we start the panel announcement, pink glasses left over there. If these belong to you, please come and claim them, or someone is walking around and not seeing very well. I'll leave these here. As you must have noticed by now, there's a lot of overlap in the topics we're covering, so the panels, to a certain extent, are very artificially divided, but we hope to continue the conversation with this one. The morning's panels gave attention to some of the problems we have, and as many of the panelists mentioned, what we need to do is have the women voice demands. So what this panel will explore is how women are organizing, either through formal politics or women's organizations, to demand change in many of the problems that exist in the societies we're talking about. So the title of the panel is Politics and Political Activism, and our first presenter is Dr. Yeşim Arat, who's Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Boğaziçi University.
Thank you. I also would like to thank the organizers and the sponsors for the conference, and also for inviting me. I didn't know what Texan hospitality was, and I'm really grateful to them for teaching me what it is. Everybody should experience it. It's really wonderful. Thank you very much. In this presentation, I shall briefly talk about women's strategies of generating power in Turkish politics. As Mrs. Ramdas over lunch quoted her Cambodian friend eloquently, politics is power, but there are different ways of politicking. My main point in this presentation is that unable to move into elected political office in substantial numbers through political parties, women in Turkey organized in civil society to have their voices heard in politics. They were a heterogeneous group, and they had different strategies of articulating political demands. Under the changing socioeconomic and political circumstances, they did become more and more mobilized, and in retrospect, they did succeed to have the legal framework amended in the context of a Turkey seeking European Union membership. But we're yet to see more substantial returns in other realms as well, in holding formal political office as well. In 1934, women had suffrage in Turkey. The founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, appointed 18 women to the Grand National Assembly in the first elections following suffrage, which was about 4.5% of the total number of MPs. Since then, the proportion of women in the parliament never went beyond. And in municipality councils, this proportion is even smaller. In Turkey, the typical male parliamentarian was well-educated and had a job and economic security. He was well-connected, benefited from the patronage of the party leaders who would shape the party list. And compared to men, women were less educated, economically inactive, and isolated from the crucial networks and patronage links necessary to be placed in the right place in party lists. For long years, women who had university degrees were only 1/4 of men, and only about 1/3 of women were economically active. While the education rates did increase, about 80% of women are literate in Turkey, women constitute only 1/4 of the economically active population. In short, the pool of educated and economically independent women who could be eligible for office was small, though not unavailable. About a third of women doctors, lawyers, and university professors are women in Turkey. However, women who could become lawyers and doctors could not develop the networks to be nominated candidates to office and be placed on eligible ranks in party lists. They could not wine and dine the way men did in party campaigns or develop the close links to party leaders who ultimately had the power to shape the lists. Ironically, and despite the claims of the party leaders, the voters did not discriminate against women, and they were ready to vote for parties who had women candidates in their lists. But politics was a man's game, and male leaders preferred to play the game with their male colleagues. There was discrimination as well as denial of this discrimination in party politics, which left women out of formal institutions of politics. Even though the percentages of women in politics and women's chances of election to high office did not change, socio-economic and political context of Turkey changed. In 1980, there was a military coup, a period of military control over the socio-economic and political realm. And in the 83 elections, there were elections in 83, but the military had its impact for many years to come. Meanwhile, women who had been active mostly in leftist politics and in touch with developments in the Western world found themselves in a political vacuum in this context of military rule. The left as well as the right was crushed. In the context of this tabula rasa, women who were exposed to second-wave feminism in the West began organizing as women in Turkey. Women's consciousness-raising groups initiated a radical rethinking of the project of modernity in Turkey and its reforms for women. The Republican reforms had displaced the Sharia with a secular civil code and encouraged women to be educated and to profit from opportunities of employment outside the house. The legitimacy of women's rights, which had been an important notion in the Republic's project of modernity, and the discourse of this legitimacy contributed to normalizing women's discrimination in politics as well as in various other realms that women have typically been discriminated in. In their process of this consciousness raising, women did not merely rethink their private relations, but also redefine their relationship to the state. They challenged the notion that they were liberated by the founding fathers of the Republic and began making demands on the state as women. They distanced themselves from the state as they articulated their individual needs as women. Issues of women's violence and sexuality, education came up in this context. So they began being a challenge to what had already, challenging what had already been given to them. In 1986, feminist women sought to go beyond the public, sought to go public beyond their consciousness-raising groups in support of the Convention for the Elimination of All Types of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Turkey had signed the convention right before the 1985 Nairobi meeting, organized in the context of the UN Decade for Women, and feminists wanted the state to put the convention into effect, change its laws accordingly, and not merely sign it to be politically correct in the international realm. About 4,000 women signed the petition. The petition campaign was a success in Turkish standards, and not only because many women signed it, but also because it exposed these women to the issues feminists problematized, alerted them to feminist concerns, helped mobilize a pool of women into the women's movement in Turkey. Feminist women were not a homogeneous group, and they diversified and multiplied over time. Over time, there were women who called themselves radical feminists, socialist feminists, Kemalist feminists, which was egalitarian women who wanted to acknowledge the founder of the Republic because of his role in expanding opportunities for women originally, as well as those who did not want to qualify their feminism. By the late 1980s, women who called themselves Islamist feminists became visible. In the 1990s, Kurdish feminists began making themselves heard through their journals. Some of these women changed their allegiances over time, and others deepened them. Each group had its own means of propagating its politics. For example, radical feminists brought out the journal Feminist, socialist feminists brought out Cactus, then another journal, Pazartesi, came out by the radical feminists. These heterogeneous group of feminists working through different coalitions with ever-expanding groups of women prioritized domestic violence and the amendment of the legal framework, particularly the civil code and the penal code. And they did play a very important role in the amendment of these codes through successful lobbying and networking efforts, which included networking through the EU as well. They began using the EU framework as well. So beyond these beyond questions specific to women, like women's sexuality, domestic violence, and the penal, legislative framework, they engaged in major political debates in Turkish politics involving the Islamist issue, the Kurdish issue. And I just want to briefly touch upon women's attempts to promote women's representation in formal institutions of politics, then mention the most recent rallies against the Islamist-rooted government and in defense of secularism in Turkey. Among all these different groups of women that were organizing in Turkey in civil society, the one that's perhaps most visible and perhaps the biggest one is Kader. In 1997, a group of mostly feminist professional women, I was one of them, came together to establish an organization to help promote women to electoral office in politics. And Kader, this association to support and educate women candidates, was a promotional interest group that started with the goal of promoting very modestly 10% women representatives in the parliament. And from its inception, the organization tried to bring together women of different ideological backgrounds, including those who didn't identify themselves as feminists. And a major founding principle of the organization was its non-partisan approach to different political persuasions and its commitment to promote women from different parties. With its 12 branches, 8 initiative groups in different provinces, and about 2,500 members, Kader is a conspicuous national organization by Turkish standards, and it's attractive to a large constituency because it pursues the empowerment of women from diverse backgrounds. Kader now, with EU backing, has raised its goal of the 10% to a 30% level for women in the parliament, and they have initiated recently a campaign for a quota for women in political representation. An extremely colorful quota campaign is taking place in Turkey now, and we just had recently in March of this year this campaign where women wearing mustaches asked the question, does one have to be a man to be elected to parliament? And after the press conference, all these posters were put all around the town, and in Istanbul, Ankara, and other cities where Kader had its branches. And of course that brought a big controversy, newspaper journalists debating the issue, is quota right, was quota bad? And Islamists began coming in, and they began making the argument that headscarfed women couldn't get into politics, and a group of women against the ban, including feminists and those who didn't call themselves feminists, posed with headscarves and asked the question, does one have to be without a headscarf to be elected to political office? So, you know, this different groups of women became part of this campaign. We don't know as yet what the actual results will be. I mean, if there will be a larger number of women in politics, but we do know that Kader did propagate feminist values in Turkey, independent of you know, how many women it did manage to promote into politics. And with its relatively large network and professionalism, it did give critical support to the successful campaigns women organized, specifically the Civil Code and the Penal Code campaigns. And it does enhance its legitimacy through the professional support it commands from academicians as well as the media in its projects to provide education to political candidates and extend services to female candidates. Briefly, again, another political engagement has been, as many of you seem to know, women's not women's rallies, but rallies and women's political participation in the past couple of weeks in these so-called Republican rallies. Women were mobilized in unprecedented numbers, and in these rallies, and women's organizations, at least certain women's organizations, were engaged in this, in mobilizing women in the rallies. I am not as convinced of the threat that is claimed to exist of the Islamists. I did not attend the rallies, but I think they were very important, not only because they were able to mobilize these unprecedented numbers, but also because they showed that women felt intensely for their values and secularism. And the organizers of these meetings, women organizers, became immediately candidates of political parties. So, you know, questions, are women using the political parties or political parties using women, is a question that comes to mind. I want to finish by a quote from Leonard Cohen, who has said that there's a crack in everything, and that's how light moves in. I think women are working through the cracks that exist in the system. When they could not move into formal institutions of politics through political parties, they began organizing through civil society, and they did have an impact in amending the legal framework, and we are yet to see the results of their engagement in politics through civil society reflected in the political office, in elected political office. Extension of women's rights in the early years of the Republic was a means through which the country secularized. In a context where the boundaries of secularism is being contested between Islamists and secularists, I do hope that women will be a force to expand rather than restrict secularism, as well as equal participation of all in collective decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Yashim. Our next speaker is Dr. Janine Clark, who is an associate professor of political science and political science at the University of Guelph, and her paper is "Women and Honor Crimes in Jordan."
Thank you very much. I just want to echo the thanks of everyone before me for all the hospitality, etc. here, to Mrs. Kelly Day for the initiative here, and the organizers to inviting me, particularly Alora. What I'm going to look at today is the role of authoritarianism in hindering women's abilities to achieve gender equity in some countries of the Middle East. And the campaign to eliminate honor crimes in Jordan is an excellent example of how women are engaged as political actors, but also at the same time of how the context of authoritarianism in which they operate plays an important role in their success or lack of it. Indeed, political dynamics, often unrelated directly to women's issues or gender norms, often result in subverting women's goals. Now, honor crimes are murders committed by fathers, brothers, uncles against female family members, supposedly for sexual transgressions that are perceived to bring shame to family honor. The sexual transgressions for which women have been killed range from adultery to pregnancy out of wedlock to flirting to receiving a phone call from a man to the mere and often false suspicion of inappropriate sexual behavior. While technically illegal in some countries of the Middle East, laws concerning honor crimes are often lax or with many loopholes. In other words, the murderers get off with extremely light sentences. In Jordan, there are 4 laws that, taken together, provide perpetrators of honor crimes loopholes or defenses for the crimes. These are Articles 97, 98, 340A, and 340B. 340A, for example, exempts from punishment a perpetrator who discovers his wife or female relatives committing adultery and then kills, injures, harms one or both of them. And it's Article 340 that's received the most attention in Jordan. Now, efforts to change Jordan's laws regarding honor crimes are not new. Certainly, the Jordanian Women's Union, a very large organization, was one of the first organizations to tackle the issue of honor crimes. And in the early 1990s, they began a campaign to amend laws that are negatively affecting women, including laws concerning honor crimes. Also, the Jordanian National Commission for Women, headed by Princess Basma, the present king's aunt, was also the first to suggest the cancelling of Article 340 in a draft that was presented to the government in 1998. However, the campaign that's received the most international attention was the campaign to eliminate so-called honor crimes. The campaign was inspired by a 15-minute segment on CNN in dealing with honor crimes in Jordan that featured Queen Noor, the late King Hussein's 4th wife, and among others, Rana Husseini, a journalist from the Jordan Times, who has won awards for her coverage of honor crimes. Now, the CNN's segment actually inspired the coming together of a core group of 11 activists, 8 of whom were women, to combat honor crimes. And it included Rana Husseini, the journalist, as well as Asma Khadr, a very prominent female human rights activist and lawyer in Jordan. And with the help of approximately 300 friends and family, as well as women's groups such as the Women's Union, the campaign embarked upon a signature campaign in order to present a petition for the abolishment of Article 340. It launched its campaign in August 1999, and within 4 months had almost 14,000 signatures, which is a huge accomplishment, as it was actually Jordan's first petition campaign in its political history. At the same time, and some people feel triggered by the negative publicity of the CNN segment, King Abdullah instructed his then Prime Minister to set up a commission, the purpose of which was to examine all laws that discriminated against women and inflicted injustice upon them. And this was part of a larger reform package. The result of this commission was a draft amendment that altered Article 340, abolished it, but introduced tougher punishments for adulterers, for murders of female relatives who were victims of rape, molestation, abduction, and also for rapists. Now, the appointed Upper House of Parliament, who was appointed by the King, approved the amendment in September 1999, and in November 1999 it was sent to the elected Lower House. In December, the elected lower house actually refused, did not pass the amendment, and sent it back up to the appointed upper house, where it was again passed and then sent back to the lower house and again rejected by the lower house, thus putting the amendment in limbo since the 2 houses could not come to an agreement. And it now required a joint session of Parliament for it to either be officially passed or officially rejected. However, in 2001, King Abdullah suspended Parliament for 2 years. And during that time period, in Parliament's absence, the King issued a series of 211 temporary laws that the Cabinet approved. And one of these, passed in December 2001, once again dealt with the amendment to Article 340. Now, when the Parliament was reconvened after June 2003 national elections, the MPs in the lower house, the elected lower house, were once again faced with the task of voting on 340. Once again, by early September 2003, the amendment had been voted twice down, defeated by the lower house, leaving it once again in limbo, waiting for a joint session. And that's where it stands today. Technically, the temporary law is on the books and is being enforced. However, for the law to be final or permanent, the Prime Minister has to call a joint session between the two houses. But the real question is, why was the law defeated when it had the full support of the king, and when the campaign had been extremely successful, when influential and large women's organizations supported the campaign, when in fact in the 2003 elections it was the first time the new quota for women had been instituted in the elections, so Parliament now had 6 female MPs, 4 of whom actually voted against it. And furthermore, when the Islamist political party, the Islamic Action Front, actually made it very clear that there was nothing in Islam to support honor crimes. So why didn't the amendment pass? Now, the international community and press championed the King's, Rana Husseini's, and the campaign's efforts at abolishing 340. In much of the international press, the case was portrayed as a progressive, Western-oriented king, upper house, and supportive activists struggling against backward MPs, and in particular, the Islamist political party, the Islamic Action Front, in the lower house. Once again, it was portrayed as Islamist groups subverting women. But I'm not sure the case was exactly how that it was exactly like that. Now, there's no doubt that the opposition parties used, the rhetoric they used in Parliament was highly patriarchal and revolved around strict gender norms and issues of religion and morality. MPs objected that the cancellation of Article 340 would be an invitation to obscenity, encouraging promiscuity and prostitution. However, to understand the politics behind these remarks, I think we have to look at the context of Jordan's electoral laws, number 1, the suspension of Parliament, number 2, and the undemocratic nature of the passing of the 211 temporary laws. Jordan's present electoral laws were implemented in 1993, and they instituted a one-person, one-vote system that we're familiar here in the West. In the Jordanian context, however, obliging people to vote for one person rather than multiple names according to the size of your district, as it had previously been done, forces voters to choose between tribal loyalties and other political leanings, such as a political party. So, for example, you would be torn between a tribal leader or somebody else you know you have some form of affiliation to, in that sense, and to whom you're expected to show loyalty, and on the other hand, representative of a party whose ideology you may in fact believe in. And in most cases, it's been shown that Jordanian voters will then vote for the tribal leader. Furthermore, the 1993 electoral laws issued by the king also readjusted the electoral districts so that they disproportionately favored traditionally tribal areas and rural towns and rural areas and small towns where strong tribal groups generally live, to the detriment of larger cities where most parties are based, as well as, such as the Islamic political party, as well as most liberal progressive parties are located, such as the city of Amman. So the result was, in the 1993, 97, and 2003 elections, a socially and politically conservative tribal leaders dominate the parliament. And the reason for the change in the tribal laws was predominantly because the king wanted to ensure that certain laws were passed in Parliament. And most specifically, most analysts argue that the change in the electoral system in 1993 was to ensure the passage of the peace treaty with Israel in 1994. And to ensure it, because there were concerns that the Islamic Action Front, the Islamist political party, would vote against it. What doing this, however, was the changing of the electoral laws not only brought a very conservative parliament to power, but in fact it very rapidly in the minds of Jordanians linked the peace treaty with authoritarianism. And as the various demonstrations grew in context of normalization with efforts with Israel, they furthermore grew even larger in context against the king and the various rollbacks of liberties the king was in the government were instituting in order to ensure policies, but also in order to stop the growing demonstrations. And the climax was, in fact, the 2-year suspension of Parliament. And once again, so we have this linking, there's sort of this authoritarian measure. It's in this context of this authoritarian measure that the 211 temporary laws were in fact passed. When Parliament reconvened, one of the very first laws that they had to deal with all these 211 temporary laws, and one of the very first ones that came up for voting was in fact Article 340. And it provided definitely MPs who were not inclined necessarily to pass it in the first place, but certainly an opportunity to vent their anger and frustration, particularly as in many ways the law was seen, these laws were seen as one more example of the king and Western supporters supposedly forcing something onto Jordan. Now, we have to keep in mind, though, that despite voting against 340, the Islamic Action Front made clear they were strongly against honor crimes, that honor crimes have nothing to do with Islam. And the issue that the Islamic Action Front raised, as well as many other, not all, but many other human rights activists, was in fact amending Article 340 wasn't even really getting at the issue, because in fact 340 deals with adultery. And that it has not been used very commonly in the courts with issues of honor crimes. And in fact, that it was the real heart of the problem lay with the other laws, 97 and 98, for example. So another explanation, we can see the IF voted against it because they felt if we're going to be dealing with adultery, they did not like the solution the government was putting forth. They wanted adultery dealt with in religious courts. And also support for the amendment was uneven amongst women's group. But the article's fate was finally sealed also, I would argue, by the royal family itself when it became too embarrassed by the negative international attention being drawn to Jordan. In fact, the campaign to eliminate honor crimes had applied repeatedly to be able to hold a peaceful protest march, and it had been denied each time. In February 2000, however, they were suddenly informed of a march that was going to take place in their names on March 14th and was going to be led by two princes. Now, large numbers of supporters, particularly from the rural tribal regions, were bussed in to support the king's position on Article 340. It was actually a very large demonstration. The government clearly took an upper hand in the issue. However, rather than garnering support for the Article 340, the march actually had the effect of delegitimizing the campaign. In the wake of the march, campaign members had increasing difficulties obtaining signatures. According to campaign members, the issue had become too controversial and too associated with the government. People no longer wanted to talk with the issue. And in fact, today, many groups have backed off from the issue temporarily or have chosen to, and certainly are not using the word honor crimes, are using words under the banner of family protection, spousal abuse. And also, shortly after the march, the entire campaign completely disbanded. Now, in sum, actually, I would say what we find is most of the women's groups have been indirectly silenced by the whole issue. And certainly right after also the campaign, I think it's a good sort of example of this, or exemplified by this, is that Asma Khadr, who had been very active in the campaign, the female human rights lawyer, was shortly thereafterwards appointed to a ministerial position, and interestingly enough, she was appointed to the position of government spokesperson that, of course, required her to defend the government and the king's position, and effectively silenced her from criticisms of the law that she had previously been making. Now, what about our 6 female MPs? I think here also we have an interesting sort of sub-story, since I have a few minutes. And I think the reason why we get 4 of the 6 voting against is the amendments also has to do with the electoral system. Jordan instituted a quota for women in parliament. 6 seats out of 110 go to women. And the way that quota works is if women doesn't win with the highest, win out and out the election in her district, then the top 6 women with the highest percentage of votes in their constituencies get a seat. The problem is, as I said before, the electoral districts are skewed towards rural areas and tribal areas and against urban areas where the country's most progressive women live. So skewed that, for example, one seat in the rural tribal town of Kerak, there is 1 seat per 6,000 voters. Whereas in Amman, where you have most Islamic Action Front is based, but also very progressive women activists, there's 1 seat per 52,255 voters. So quite naturally, of the 6 women who came to Parliament, 5 came from rural areas, 3 of which appeared to be put forward by their tribes to take advantage of the quota for their own purposes. And the 6th and final member was, in fact, a woman from the Islamic Action Front. So we had a group that was, by nature of the way the quota works, bound to vote against the law. And in final conclusion, I'll just say that I think the case of honor crimes and to an extent the quota reveals several important issues regarding women and politics in the region, most important of which is that women are neither submissive nor powerless in the region, but as everyone else has mentioned, are very active in trying to take hold of their future. It also furthermore demonstrates what women are up against, why they may fail, and perhaps most importantly, that the reasons for their failure are not always what they first appear to be. If women have fewer rights than men, if they appear to be second-class citizens, it is not because women have not tried to alter the situation, nor is it necessarily because of the supposedly rigid nature of patriarchy or Islam. Rather, we must look at authoritarian nature of the political systems in the region and, to a lesser extent, to the political instability at large.
Thank you, Janine. Our next speaker is Dr. Shahla Hayari. Are you coming up here? She's coming up here. And her paper is Religion, Women, and Political Agency in Iran. She is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director of Women's Studies at Boston University.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mrs. Kelly Day. Thank you, Elora Shahabuddin, for having invited me here today, and thank you all for being here today. On Sunday morning, my sister called me from Tehran and told me that our father, had passed away. I debated whether to drop everything and fly to Iran or to keep my commitment and fly to Houston. Knowing my father, I think he would have liked me to be here with you today. He has been a constant source of support for me, and I am going to miss him terribly. He is one man among many men in Iran and in the Middle East who support their daughters, sisters, wives, and I'd like to acknowledge that. It is to my father and to his indomitable spirit that will always be with me that I would like to dedicate my talk today. I would like to begin my presentation by telling you 3 episodes which sets the stage for my discussion today. 1. As one of the 13 women elected to the 6th Majlis, the so-called reformist parliament, Dr. Elahe Kulai, a professor of political science at Tehran University, publicized her intention to replace her all-enveloping black chador, the so-called power suit worn by women in the parliament, with the Islamic veiling, which means a long overcoat, pants, and scarf. There was an immediate hue and cry from some male politicians and journalists and some women who threatened to harm her should she go through with her decision. Kulai resisted pressure, insisted in sporting Islamic veiling, and she prevailed. And she said in an interview to me, "Many of my friends told me that I was walking on a landmine. I told them I was willing to walk over a landmine to show that Islam does recognize the right of individuals, and that Islam rises above these kinds of oppressions and superstitions that are forced on people in the name of religion." Scene 2. This is, again, a conversation I had with Dr. Fatemeh Haqiqatjou, who was another member of the parliament, of the reformist parliament, 6th Majlis. She said, "Before I was elected to the 6th Majlis, I strongly believed in a religious state, but my experience of 4 years in the parliament convinced me that religion and the state must be separate. I am not talking about eliminating religion, but when a state uses religion as a means to an end, it alienates people from both religion and the state." And I have to tell you, she's from a very religious background. And by the way, I provided some slides for you to be seen, but I'm not quite sure how to coordinate them because they're not really necessarily related, but there are some visual, and I don't know where here. Well, I just have to go quickly. Anyways, I'm just going to continue, and then I switch this. Now, scene 3. On June 12, 2006, a small group of women and their male supporters gathered in a major square in Tehran to demand legal equality between genders. Perceiving their demand as subversive, the state harshly broke up their peaceful congregations, using female police to manhandle the demonstrators. Some 73 people were arrested, 28 of whom were significantly men. That is to say, the women's male supporters. After a short detention, the majority of the activists were conditionally released, though their saga has continued, and it is continuing. Now, subsequently, the activists and feminists mobilized their resources to launch a campaign to collect 1 million signatures, which was already mentioned this morning, in order to force the legislature to change the unequal and restrictive personal laws. And this campaign is well underway, and you may have seen it in the internet. Through their political activities and engagement with institutions of power, women such as the one mentioned above have done much to transform the socio-political climate in Iran. I believe, as do many others, that a robust and vibrant women's movement is in the making in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not despite of, but because of the reviving and implementing serious legal restrictions and discriminatory political practices. In the geopolitics of the Middle East, Iran provides a unique political case. The state's experimentation with Islamization in the past 28 years seems to have, in fact, encouraged the development of a dynamic and vibrant, if at times battered, democracy movement. Women's movement, still emerging and not quite organized, forms a significant part of this larger move towards democracy in Iran. Although the women's movement as a whole may not yet have any publicly acknowledged leadership or a definite political structure and organization, its influence is undeniably felt by the religious hierarchy that controls the state in Iran. President Khatami's landslide election of 1997 is generally credited to the active participation of women and youth. Iranian women are, of course, neither a monolithic, neither in their ethnicity and class, nor in their aspirations, discourses, and objectives. On the whole, however, the literacy rate in Iran is over 70%, and is still higher in urban centers such as Tehran, and women have a 65% competitive advantage in the college, again, as was mentioned this morning. And in another conversation I had with a feminist lawyer who also publishes a monthly magazine called Women's Legal Rights, Huquq Zanan, she told me, quote, "Women have conquered men's biggest stronghold, and that is the universities and educational institutions." Now the question is, how did Iranian women, who by and large became the target of a punitive theocratic regime, have now emerged to form a significant pressure group that, in the words of another high-ranking political woman I interviewed, they can no longer be silenced or ignored? Understanding this paradox is the subject of my ongoing research. Now today, briefly, I want to mention 3 intimately interrelated themes within which we can understand women's political agency and mobilization in Iran. Let me just jump a few more of these. Okay. All right, there we are. The first is the broader context of modernity that affected and transformed Iranian traditional culture, political structure, and gender relations. In time, modernity, it has been argued, contributed to the parallel yet countervailing developments of fundamentalism and feminism. That is to say, the same forces that led to the creation of fundamentalism also contributed to the development of feminism. Second is the development of structural incongruities and fundamental inconsistencies in the Islamic State's rhetoric and policies. On the one hand, the state lauds ad infinitum, the highest status of women in Islam, but on the other, it has reinstated a restrictive and literal version of Sharia law, limited women's professional and career options, and mandated veiling in public. Such essentially controlling and anti-democratic state policies have culminated in sharpening women's sense of the state's political oppression and of their legal subjugations, rendering the state's patriarchal double standard and hypocrisy transparent. And lastly is the widening gap between society and the state. Again, that was mentioned this morning. That is to say, while society has undergone rapid socio-political transformations and change, the state has resisted legal changes, upholding family and personal laws as divine and as rooted in the presumably immutable nature of male and female, hence resistance to change. Now, the politically seductive public calls to women to come to the public domain and to protest against the Shah, most vociferously articulated by Ayatollah Khomeini, did much to break the old religious taboos of women's seclusion and to open up new vistas for women and to awaken women's apparently dormant public agency. Huge numbers of women welcomed the chance to move out of the confinement of their homes, to appear in the public domain and to demonstrate side by side their male colleagues. Having consolidated its power as an Islamic state, however, it's very important to realize that the state or the revolution was not an Islamic revivalist movement. Initially was a popular revolution, but then later on it became an Islamic state. So the Islamic State moved quickly to dismantle the family protection law of 1967 and to roll back some modest legal changes that had been made in women's status and to mandate veiling in public domain. Significant numbers of women were driven out of their jobs and educational and professional avenues become restricted. But of course, in time, both of them were open to women, and now women, as was mentioned before, have gone back to perform various economic functions and go into institutions. Now, although the forced veiling faced vociferous objections by women and continues to be resisted by many, in the long run, the structure, function, and meaning of public veiling was shifted from one of controlling and limiting women's agency and mobility to one of legitimating women's public awareness and political agency. Having no option, many women actively own the veil and use that as a tactical tool for their political actions and professional performances. If at one point in the Iranian history, the unveiling and women released their creative energy to express themselves in poetry and novels, the reveiling also motivated them to actively move into education, profession, and politics, again with the state's blessing initially. Faced with an unyielding ideological state, many Iranian women, much like feminists in other societies and religious traditions, have become active on several fronts. While challenging the patriarchal monopoly of sacred knowledge by rapidly gaining expertise in the law and the scripture, they have resisted to blindly obeying the received patriarchal traditions. We hear that again. Nor are many feminists and activists willing to relinquish the domain of their religion and spirituality to men. And it was lovely to hear Ruth this morning talk about that. Millions of women find solace in religion, though not necessarily in its textual, formal, and legalistic interpretations and practices that have been filtered through patriarchal prism. Additionally, Iranian feminists and activists have become increasingly sophisticated in global communications in the uses of internet and cyberspace in order to record, to voice out, to communicate their ideas and their version of gender-balanced social order. I just want you to see Mrs. Kulai here. This is Mrs. Kulai, who was mentioned earlier. Cyberspace provides a powerful site of contestation between women's determination to express their discontent and the state's determination to stifle it. Intolerant of dissent and abusive of women's legal and human rights, the state, particularly the so-called hardliner governments, have consistently attempted to filter women's activist websites. Just as consistently, the latter have moved their websites to another location, sending out quick alerts to inform their readerships of the change. Discriminated against and dissatisfied, women have become increasingly aware of and impatient with the incongruity between the Islamic State's rhetoric regarding the respect and high status accorded women in Islam and their humiliating legal and political and social inequalities, between the model of the ideal womanhood held up for them and the deprivation of the basic rights to keep the custody of their children, for instance, in case of divorce, between educationally surpassing men in colleges and universities and the illogic of the restrictions to travel abroad without their husbands' or fathers' written permission, between demand for female modesty and the legal encouragement for plural marriages for men. In short, women have increasingly resisted their unfair treatment in social, political, and economic spheres, and challenged the ethics of the discriminatory political and legal practices that permeate their daily life. Wittingly or unwittingly, just go a few more, it seems the state has painted itself into a corner by the logic of its own rhetoric, by stressing that Islam has raised women's status, yet humiliating women consistently by denying them equal rights and opportunities for self-realization. Aware and alert, Iranian women activists and feminists have begun to agitate for the state to match its words with action, to help women materialize the highest status they are said to have had all along. Finding common grounds and mobilizing their resources, Iranian women have thus pushed the successive governments in the Islamic Republic of Iran to face the logic of its own double standard with more or less success. And this is the deepening dilemma facing the religious state in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahla. Our next paper is by Dr. Marianne Tetreault. She's Una Chapman Cox Distinguished Professor of International Affairs at Trinity University, so a neighbor. And her paper is Free at Last, Women's Political Rights in Kuwait.
What I'd like to do first is to donate 30 seconds of my time. Would you all please stand up, raise your arms, and take 3 deep breaths? Okay? And I'm going to do it too. Okay. We can't sing Take You Out to the Ball Game, but it's a moral poem. Okay. I also would like to thank Secretary and Mrs. Baker. I'd like to thank the Baker Institute, and I'd really like to thank Kelly Day. You know, when the rest of us have cosmic birthdays, our friends give us parties and give us presents. And you have a cosmic birthday, and we all get the presents. And thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. On the 16th of May, 2005, Kuwaiti women won something they'd been working for 43 years. They got the right to vote and to run for office in their country. But the question that my title asks is free at last, and that title comes from our own experience, my own experience as an American. Because one of the great disappointments in American history was the emancipation of the slaves, which didn't mean that they were free at all. We can go back and look at the liberated black people after the Civil War and find that they had very little in the way of capital resources, no 40 acres and a mule, no literacy or very little literacy, very little that they had to fall back on. They had very limited protection against violence. They operated under a great many social constraints. Many of them were killed for trying to assert their rights. And in 1877, Reconstruction was over, and they became legally inferior all over again, which just shows you that passing a law and 50 cents probably won't get you a cup of coffee. You need to have more cemented things in. And as a result, more than 150 years later, black Americans are still struggling to get their rights. And this was very much in my mind on Sunday when I read an article in the New York Times that has pictures of the DNA 200 people who have been exonerated from life imprisonment because of the DNA test finding that they were innocent. The overwhelming proportion of these people are black. Well, I am very happy to say that Kuwaiti women are in a lot better shape than freed slaves in the United States following their legal emancipation, but the way ahead is still not entirely clear. The good news is that Kuwaiti women do have money. This is one of the blessings of Islam, which allows women control over their own money, gives them rights to inheritance, and Kuwaiti women are sharp, and most of them just take this up, and this is why you have gold bracelets and other things that are going to see you through horrible things. There also is a lot of human capital held by women in Kuwait, and this is thanks to a very far-seeing Emir Abdullah Salem, who starting in the 1950s had compulsory education for boys and girls. So you have a very literate, very well-educated female population in Kuwait. Girls in Kuwait also have access to family resources. Even when they grow up to be women, they can call on their dads to shell out, for example, for their political campaigns. Nabila Al-Anjari ran for the parliament last year, and her father was a parliamentarian himself, a former justice minister, kicked in a bundle. She had a very elaborate campaign. It was quite nice. We can contrast this to Fatma Al-Mutari, who ran against, over the dead bodies of every man in her family. They stopped her mobile phone so no one could get in touch with her. It took her forever to sort of get a grip on her campaign. So we can see that this isn't, 100% on our side. However, the good news is that there's a lot of state support for women. The current emir is very pro-woman, and in fact he led the successful last campaign for full political rights for Kuwaiti women, and he used every tool at his disposal. He did log rolling, he traded off, he said, I'll give you more money in Social Security, I will raise state salaries. When all else failed, he paid bribes, and then he got really smart, and when the Women's Rights Bill came up, it had come up on a second reading, and it was only going to give women the right to vote. So the government just pops in that morning and says, oh, by the way, we have a brand new bill that supersedes this one, gives women full political rights, and it comes with an order of urgency, meaning we vote on it today and that is it. And by God, it was. Women in Kuwait also have been very lucky in that they have served very useful apprenticeships. They are ready for political power and ready for working in the government. Since 1963, there have been women's voluntary associations in Kuwait. There are a lot of assistant ministers in Kuwait who are women who are in reality running their departments. This is something that American women who are assistant thises and that's know about very well. And we do have two full cabinet ministers now in Kuwait, Masuma Mubarak, who was mentioned this morning. She's the Minister of Health. Her former ministry got abolished. And Muthia Hamoud, who is the new Minister of Education. She was formerly the Dean of the School of Law and Commerce. There's a new parliamentary program which is really interesting. It appoints women volunteers, and so you've got all these women who are lawyers and bureaucrats and whatever, and they get to go around and look at things like prisons and hospitals and other kinds of institutions. They go to court to see how well family violence is actually being dealt with, and then they come out and tell everybody how things are really working or not. There's also a great deal of recognition of Kuwaiti women's competence in the private sector. There was a program, there still is, but it's kind of petering out, on the government providing initial capital grants to small projects to entrepreneurs. And the people who paid off their loans at first, the first two payoffs came from female-headed businesses. The largest brokerage firm in Kuwait, Global Investments, is headed by a woman, and there are women in managerial positions all over the place. Well, why would I think that there might be problems here? Well, there are still there are always structural problems in every society. I think that social mores are a lot more flexible than the sedimentation in education. And here I want to pick up on some of the things that Eleanor talked about. Because over the past, at least 30 years, Islamists have been colonizing the education bureaucracy, which means that the curriculum might be all well and good in some ways, although I would say that most of it is pretty awful in many ways. But even language training uses religious texts, and many of them emphasize female moral and intellectual inferiority. So here you are, learning how to, speak good Arabic as you are saying bad things about yourself and your mom and everybody else. In 1996, the Parliament passed a law to segregate Kuwait University by men and women, and there are all kinds of sort of very bizarre ways that this is being carried out. But now there's a push to segregate the private universities, and this is very problematic. Part of what gives women social authority is the normalization of women appearing in various roles. If you see them all over the place and they're doing things, you begin to think that this is what women do. Another very useful thing to having men and women go to college together is that they get used to one another, and men get used to being interrupted by women, corrected by women, all kinds of other useful things. And both of these are threatened very much by gender segregation. The kind of behavior that we would all like to stop as a result of integration is what happened when Mudi Ahmud was sworn in as the education minister. There was some hooting and hollering by a few Salafi in the parliament. The speaker slapped them right down. But in the grand scheme of things, what you need to have is an environment where women's public behavior is normal. We had another kind of ambiguous event for the future of Kuwaiti women as political actors, and that was how their very first inauguration in national politics came about. In 2006, there was a surprise parliamentary election. Women had only gotten the right to vote and run in 2005, and they were all waiting to gear up for 2009. They were all going to go run in 2009, or at least many were preparing for this. No one was ready to run a year after. They had no infrastructure, no campaign managers, no nothing, and it was very, very difficult for people to declare a candidacy on such short notice. As a result, women garnered very few votes. The top vote getter was Rola Dashti. She got fewer than 10% of the votes in her district, although she made a wonderful showing and she ran a great campaign. And one of the nicest things about this election was that all the women lost, but they lost with a great deal more grace than the average man, or even extraordinary men lose in Kuwait. So they did very well. But they had a number of problems that we could look at. This election was a surprise because it was the result of grassroots pressure. Young people in Kuwait lobbied, demonstrated, and basically caused the government to fall because they wanted to have a change in the election law. They endorsed, this was called the Orange Movement. They wore orange T-shirts and they had little orange doodahs tied around their arms and whatnot. But none of the women who ran in 2006 was identified with this Orange Movement. They weren't invited and they didn't push. And this is part of what inexperience gets you. You just don't know what you can do. This very first engagement of women in the political system was overshadowed by the basic issue of the election, which was not that women were voting for the first time on this huge, long agenda of issues they'd been pushing for, 43 years, but that the government was corrupt. And everyone was very, very concerned about changing the voting law to decrease corruption and to get at corruption in other ways. The corruption is so intense that this really overshadowed for the domestic audience this new enfranchisement of women. That's all we heard about outside of the country, but if you were in Kuwait, you experienced a very different election than the one you experienced from Houston or New York or from London or from Paris, especially from Paris. The turnout, in spite of all of this, was very high. It turned out that women love elections. They all came out. I mean, people's mothers came out. They went out to all these Diwaniyas. They stayed up all night. They talked to candidates. They had a great time. And about 60% of women turned out. 80% of men turned out. Most people who aren't Americans are very enthusiastic voters, and even first-time Kuwaiti women. Few women ran, as I say. They had a very disadvantageous position. Only 28 made it all the way to the end. And most of the really prominent women decided to wait, with the exception of a very small handful who are all gearing up already to run again. So I look for more participation and more candidates in 2010. The biggest potential obstacles that lie ahead, though, I think are independent of some of them are independent of the political system. One of them, of course, is spillover from the war. We haven't talked very much about the war at this conference, is probably just as well, but one of the things the war has stimulated in Kuwait has been an upsurge in populist jihadism by young people. A number of young men hopped in their cars and drove to Fallujah in November 2004, and the terrorists who were picked up and wrapped up in early 2005, the Peninsula Lions, had a very bad record of being really rotten to women. A few years earlier, they had kidnapped a young woman from the university and took her out in the desert and beat her up because they didn't think that she was properly clothed. Broke her arm, went to court, snivelled and whined, got let off with a kiss on both cheeks and promised not to do it again. And then, of course, you have to arrest them later when they're putting bombs in malls. There also are potential economic difficulties. The current boom in Kuwait is very much war dependent, I think, not only in terms of high oil prices, but very high demand for real estate and services coming from military personnel and contractors. There's also, and this kind of overshadows what is a persistent structural problem with youth unemployment, which is a direct result of the education establishment being very unwilling and or unable to prepare people for jobs in the real world. This is very, very problematic. This has been countered to a degree by the opening of private colleges, and the Kuwait University has responded by upgrading its curriculum, but you still have a lot of difficulties with people not being prepared for the job market. In terms of gender differential in education, women do much better than men in school. They do much better than men in jobs. And as a result, this is a situation where radical Islamists can mobilize male antagonism. They can get membership, and they can focus a lot of this hatred on women. This is very problematic. And finally, there is this sort of snake in the chandelier or whatever, and that is the basic issues. What kinds of things are women really going to be concerned about when they do get into Parliament? One of the big things, of course, is family law. And for all that we can talk about men being very generous, I think that the most generous men to women are fathers. Fathers are very good to their daughters. There's a very famous history of women in the United States, women's emancipation, called Daughters of the Promised Land. There is no book called Wives of the Promised Land. And I think that when you get to the point where you're looking for your equal rights with your male peers, you are in trouble. And so the future lies ahead on the really big jobs that women have to do. But Kuwaiti women are smart and tough, and I bet you they're going to do just fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Our final speaker for this panel is Jean Said Maktasi, who's an independent writer and researcher, and her paper is Problems in Formulating a Convincing Arab Feminism.
Thank you, Laura. I'd like to, like everyone else, thank the sponsors and the organizers of this conference. I know what enormously hard work goes into preparing a conference, so thank you to all of you. There are probably few segments of human society that have been as stereotyped as women in the Arab world. This is not surprising, as there has been a continuous build-up of the stereotype for almost 200 years in, among other things, Orientalist literature, travel writing, anthropology, feminist discourse, and international politics. If one looks at some of the European or American writing on women of the 19th century, one finds the foundational discourse on Arab women as well as its raison d'etre. Women of the East, as they were so often called, are backward, degraded, ignorant wretches, barely achieving the status of animals and living for the sole purpose of satisfying the sexual demands of their men, in perpetual darkness of body, soul, and mind. In this vision, no distinction is made of class, region, educational standard, or other particular circumstance. Nor was the memory of the 19th century European or American writers who produced these early stereotypes troubled by the oppression of women in their own societies at that time. This stereotypical picture, which has increased in intensity in our time, because of the media, of course, has not just maligned Arab women, Arab men, Arab marriages, and Arab society in general. It has been so egregious that it has repeatedly helped provide the rationale for direct political interventions by arguing that political or military interventions, by arguing that Arab and or Muslim women are so oppressed by their society that outside action is required to rescue them from it. It has penetrated and dominated the Western public consciousness and thus helps to sustain the policies of the great powers. It can surely be no secret that the image of oppressed women and of violent, religiously fanatical men diffused on a regular basis in the powerful and pervasive media has helped create a negative impression that sustains American policy towards the Arab world in general and towards the Arab-Israeli conflict in particular. All of this has created a defensive reaction in the Arab world, and in my judgment, it has done a great deal of harm to the Arab women's movement and to Arab feminist discourse. Because the stereotyping is regarded as an integral, deliberate, and necessary part of a larger and more dangerous attack on Arab culture, undertaken to discredit it and thus make possible physical aggression, it is clear to intelligent Arab women, and especially those in the women's movements, that they are in danger of being used against themselves and their own people. Of course, I am not saying that there is no real discrimination. There certainly is, as there is elsewhere. It doesn't mean that there are no unjust laws. There are a great many, or that there are not many women who are indeed oppressed, or that there are no husbands who beat or otherwise mistreat their wives. Of course there are. Or that there are not plenty of reasons for an active women's movement to fight all these injustices. There are, and there is. The beginnings of an extremely vital and active women's movement in the Arab world goes back at least to the early days of the 20th century. Indeed, feminist language and demands go back into the 19th century. It is my contention, however, that there has grown in our time a marked and dangerous split between the feminist movement and what I specifically will call the women's movement, that is, the movement of women activists, which has damaged both and which has led to the women's movement working by and large without the guiding ideology of feminism. Let me at this point clarify 2 points. First, although I believe that what I am saying is true of the Arab world and certainly of the Arab Mashriq, my remarks are based on my direct experiences and knowledge of the people and the methods of the women's movements in Lebanon. I have no charts and no graphs and no figures to support what I'm saying, but many years of reading and writing in Arab feminism and discussions for many years also with friends and colleagues in the region. Secondly, let me explain the terms I'm using. When I speak of members of the women's movement, I'm referring to those who address specific problems facing women in particular circumstances, who deal with these problems practically and try to solve them one by one. In tackling particular issues, they are deeply aware of the limitations of their own power and the power of women in general, and demand from the local power structure only that degree of change they think can be extracted from it. In general, they believe that change should be sought and achieved step by step, one thing at a time. In general, too, they do not believe in attempting to reach what could be regarded as unattainable goals. They do not attempt, it is not their business to attempt, to change the mindsets of the political, economic, religious, educational establishments, or of the general public, except as these relate to the particular problem at hand. Indeed, they often try to avoid making very large claims precisely in order not to scare off the necessary political support. Nor do they publicly challenge the givens of social and political life, whether based in religious custom, local power structures, or economic realities. Whatever their individual beliefs, and some of the women activists I know have great contempt for the power structures, they approach their tasks diplomatically, with an eye out for achieving results rather than scoring ideological points. I have often heard them cite the Lebanese proverb, "We want to eat grapes, not kill the watchman." They have given up the battle for such things as civil marriage or the reform of the nationality laws are always pushed aside at times of crisis. And as you know, and certainly today we can say, and certainly in Lebanon, but throughout the region, times of crisis are there to stay, apparently. They don't go away. When I refer to feminists, on the other hand, I mean those who aim beyond the particular and the action, and who raise the bar, so to speak, by philosophizing the problems faced by women. Relating particular problems to each other, they seek to identify in all aspects of past and present society the sources of a general injustice against women. They place the particular issues in a broad framework that itself becomes the object they wish to change. In short, the metaphor that I could use to clarify the difference between what I am calling the women's movement and the feminist movement is the difference between plumbers and engineers, with all my respect to both plumbers and engineers and feminists and activists. I don't mean the slightest disrespect for any of them. And I certainly have an enormous respect for many of the women activists I know, because they're enormously hardworking, intelligent people, but I think there is a problem. Nor do I mean to suggest that the only difference between them is that one set acts while the other writes, though I'm afraid that is today too often the reality. I do believe that at one time there was a greater cooperation, if not unity. I don't know that in the past you could separate the feminists from the activists between them than exists now, and that in any case they should complement each other's work. Feminism, I think, should be guiding and illuminating the women's movement by providing wide arguments for broad change. And it is not, in my judgment, today fulfilling its role, at least not to a sufficiently broad public. I believe it is in decline or in crisis. The feminist reinterpretation of history, literature, politics, education, biography, religion, medicine, and so on has not achieved the wide attention that might have generated a mass mobilization of women to fight the good fight, nor has it provided the argumentations necessary for an ambitious program of change on all these fronts. And because of the absence of masses of women committed to feminist principles, the feminist movements in the Arab world, and consequently the women's movements as well, have remained marginal to the major political currents of society, easily ignored by the powers that be in organizing the world in which we live. The reason for the relative ineffectiveness of the feminist movement is, I believe, ironically, precisely the eagerness of its members to be part of the political current of their society. Like the members of the women's movements, they are especially keen on their national identity. They wish to be directly involved in the struggles for economic, social, and political development, clean environment, improved educational systems, and all the other issues of modern society, as well as in the nationalist struggles, such as the continuing conflict with Israel. Indeed, women seem much keener to demonstrate for national causes than they do for matters which concern them exclusively. I once went downtown to stand in front of the Parliament in response to a call by one of the women's groups for a demonstration demanding reforms to the labor laws. Only a handful of women showed up, and none of them were laborers, I might say. This did not impede the eventual passage of the reform for which the women in charge had worked so hard. They had diligently prepared the ground by gathering the support of individual MPs, and especially those in strategic positions, without in any way threatening their power. On the other hand, women's demonstrations for nationalist causes will bring out thousands of women. Just look at any moment in Palestinian society today. This brochure of the most venerable of the activist women's groups in Lebanon illustrates the desire not to be isolated from the main issues of society. The League works for achieving factual equality, factual meaning actual equality between women and men, implementing CEDAW, developing the role of women, and so on and so forth, and then protecting the sovereignty and independence of Lebanon, aiming towards a secular and non-confessional society, activating the role of Lebanese youth in society and stopping immigration, protecting the environment, and so on. You see, aside from all the demands for women, there are all these other demands that have to do not with women, or at least not specifically to women. Perhaps more than any other national group of women that I know of, certainly much more than their American or European counterparts, Arab women, for the reasons I have mentioned, are constantly aware of and extremely sensitive to the nuances of international politics and have an extremely important and direct relationship with it. This is perhaps the main reason activists have been avoiding the ideological tenets of feminist thought. The danger is that feminist proposals and arguments would be used, or would even seem to be used, against their own societies by playing into the hands of the policymakers. The recent American campaign to democratize the Arab world has taken the situation of women as one of the measures of success or failure. To put it another way, as most people do, this success or failure really means compliance or non-compliance with American political demands. I think this has dealt another great blow to the Arab feminist movement. While, of course, an increase in democratic practices is a laudable goal for which many have been fighting for decades or even generations, very few people wish to be identified as elements of American foreign policy, especially as that policy has been regarded as so hostile to the Arab world and so friendly to the Israelis. Therefore, Arab feminists are in a quandary. Already at a disadvantage because of the wide perception of feminism as an imported ideology in the first place, they're in a delicate position and caught in a double bind. If they denounce the laws and other realities that discriminate against women in their societies, they're in danger of being seen as complicit with the cultural attack I have already described. If, on the other hand, they defend their culture and national practice from attack, they are in danger of becoming complicit with the very injustices they are dedicated to defeating and with their own governments, many of which, to put it mildly, have not earned their support. There are other very difficult problems facing feminist thought, too numerous to describe here. I'll just mention a few. Governments throughout the world, I think, and certainly in the Arab world, in response to pressures both internal and external, including, for instance, CEDAW, have been gradually appropriating the language and demands of feminism for their own ends, thus robbing it of some of its credibility. Another major problem lies in the various forms of religious fundamentalism that use women as symbols. And here, of course, I don't mean only Muslim fundamentalism, but Jewish fundamentalism and Christian fundamentalism, all of which have been involved in violent and dangerous actions against the people. And my own personal obsession is with the paralyzing, facile, and in my judgment, utterly false dichotomy that has grown up without clear examination or proof that opposes what is called tradition with what is called modernity. I don't have time to go into that. And then finally, of course, the worst of all, the three-letter word, which is more obscene than all the four-letter words in the language, war. Every time there's a war, and there are lots of them, as you can see, the women's movement and all feminist discussion and demands gets pushed aside and becomes secondary, becomes irrelevant, becomes totally, you simply can't talk about it. It is for these and other reasons, I believe, that women's societies and organizations have been working against injustice and for greater advancement without either the disadvantage or the benefit of the complicating theoretical cover that might be offered by feminism. They try to work under the radar, so to speak, avoiding the difficult theoretical questions and problematic relationships that would come from adopting a directly feminist stance. Indeed, many of them unambiguously denounce feminism altogether. Yet it seems to me that it is precisely feminist theory that can and should find solutions for the problems I mentioned above. I see my red light has even not only come, but it's also gone, so I guess I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you all for your patience. This was the longest panel, but we have 15 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please come to one of the microphones and identify yourself. And of course, the panelists can ask questions of one another. So we have a little time. Any questions? Hi.
Hi, first I'd just like to thank all my friends and colleagues for wonderful presentations. One question to Janine. Janine, you mentioned that one of the main obstacles in Jordan, and of course you had a very instructive analysis, that really focused on state authoritarianism as the main obstacle to women's political participation and so on.
To honor crimes.
To the honor crimes, I'm sorry, yes, of course. But it seems to me that your analysis actually drew attention to some other factors, which is really these divisions within the state apparatus itself and within the political elite. When I think of Jordan, of course, you're the Jordan expert, and we had a little bit of a discussion about this last night, but when I think of Jordan, I think actually of a weak state with lots of contending political forces. So you have the royalty and the monarch and the family, which have a particular position and on an approach to, let's say, honor crimes. And then you have the tribes that may be split on the subject. And then you have the government, and in particular those members of parliament in the lower house who tend to be very, very conservative. So rather than see a kind of homogeneous, monolithic, authoritarian state, I see actually a lot of fragmentation in Jordan. And that, it seems to me, seems to be the main obstacle to the adoption of a set of women-friendly laws and policies, including, the repeal of Article 340. So that's one question. And then for Jean, I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you afterwards concerning what I see as much more of a diverse set of strategies in the Middle East and North Africa, Arab women's movements as well as in Iran and Turkey, much more so than I thought that the picture that you were giving of a somewhat more undifferentiated attitude and approach. It seems to me that there are so many different strategies across countries and also different strategies within countries. And there are many differences between, for example, the strategies that women's organizations have chosen in Lebanon to those that were chosen in, for example, Algeria. Despite the fact that the women's organizations there, the feminist organizations, during the crisis years of the 1990s, were referred to by the fundamentalists as Hizb Fransa, as a fifth column, in fact. They actually were a dominant force and a very strong force during that period for women's rights and against fundamentalism. So, but this is a very long, and your presentation was absolutely eloquent and very, very thought-provoking in many ways, but I think I'll look forward to a conversation with you about that later on. Thank you. Sorry.
Janine and then Jean.
Okay, I'll just respond. I think I wanted to put this whole issue of honor crimes in context of the authoritarian measures, but I also still think I would call the Jordanian state authoritarian and fairly strong, actually, for several reasons. One, we've had a consistent rollback of all political liberties. Jordanians have far, far fewer rights today than they did 5 years ago, and even fewer than they did 10 years ago. Almost everything that was introduced in 1989 has been rolled back. and very effectively. At the same time, the royal family has managed not to alienate its support base, predominantly the tribes. The army is solidly behind the royal family. The civil service, while grumbling and certainly not liking all measures, is dominated by tribal families that remain solidly behind the royal family. So there isn't a lot of weakness. The royal family's been very successful, and right now, in fact, they're debating a new NGO law that, in fact, is much stricter than the previous NGO law, far more surveillance than ever before. It's going to be, if it's passed, and it probably will be, one of the strictest. In fact, the government has managed, and the government are the tribes predominantly, so you really can't distinguish between tribes and government. Tribal members dominate overwhelmingly the government. Despite all the debate in Parliament, the government has managed to get every piece of legislation through Parliament that it wanted. The terrorism law, the new political parties law, all of these have gone through. So, there is quite a bit of strength there, I would say, despite, yes, there are divisions. Jordan is, without a doubt, must be placed within the context of a very large identity debate over the future of Jordan and where it's going. And this is part of the reason why all sides dig in so deeply to their positions. Certainly in the case of the honor crimes, I think what makes it interesting is it actually is a case where the tribes go against what the king wanted. To a large extent. And that also explains why the Islamic Action Front really could also take an extremist, well, I don't want to say extremist, but dig in so deeply into its position. Because if the tribes are going to go against it, why on earth would they compromise? So, I mean, you had this unique, it's almost a unique case where you have this almost unspoken alliance between, the two sides. So yes, there are big debates going on in Jordan, but in the context of this ongoing authoritarianism, I think Jordan, we see these very unique alliances, not only the unspoken ones I just mentioned between tribes and Islamic Action Front on this particular issue, but certainly many issues have now fallen and been relabeled under this larger identity debate that includes relations with Israel, includes foreign policy on Iraq, and even includes economic stances that we actually see very interesting alliances where leftists and Islamists, for example, will work together. Hope that answered your question.
Jean?
Is this not working? I don't know.
There it goes.
No?
The back?
Thank you for your question or your comment or your question. Of course, in 15 minutes, I was drawing a sort of with broad strokes. I guess you don't draw. I was painting with broad strokes. I think also I was talking more about the Mashriq than the Maghrib, although I have talked at some length with some Moroccan or Tunisian friends, and I think they have the same general feeling I do. I think that when I talked about the power, the business of power, and the marginality of this whole issue when there's a crisis, I'm thinking specifically, I mean, if you look at Palestine today, or Lebanon, or Iraq for that matter, I mean, who's going to start talking now about women's issues? I mean, it's not even in the, there was a big campaign in Lebanon that started just before the assassination of Prime Minister Hariri and there was beginning to be a big campaign. It wasn't as big as I wanted it to be myself, as I was critical of it, because it was a campaign for nationality, the nationality campaign that we all know about. That is the demand that women should have the right to pass citizenship onto their children and husband if they're married to foreigners. It was half-hearted to begin with, because they were not going to demand the right for the husband, but just for the children, because they thought that was the activists now, you see, working. And then, of course, it got completely pushed aside in the crises of the last 2 years. It was just hardly been mentioned even. That's the kind of thing, I mean, in Iraq or in Palestine, who's going to talk now about women's rights? The women themselves are having a hard time. The feminists, I've talked with many of them, they feel, what are we to do right now? I mean, how are you going to raise this issue at this particular moment? It's very difficult. It's not that they don't, and it's not that there isn't power. It's just that the issue becomes secondary to survival. That's basically what.
Other questions? Francis, you have to come to the microphone.
Frances Hasso. I was just going to follow up on your comment that, I think the problem is seeing national identity or religious identity as somehow external to feminine subjectivity, and then, sort of a gender identity as essential to feminine subjectivity. So I think that's why I think that even myself as a full-fledged feminist, depending on the context, since our subjectivities are formulated in these complex, imbricated ways, it makes a lot of sense to me that poverty or war would overwhelm anything. I think that what we need to be concerned about, I guess for me as an American citizen, is the way in which our policymakers, since we're at a policy conference, actually feed into and contribute and create new articulations of patriarchies, sectarianisms, racisms, and I see that in Iraq, and we see it all over the place in the way in which policymakers operate with power elites in the region, creating actually new power elites on the premise that somehow they're working with traditional forms of power, but what happens is they create new forms of power that are destructive. So I get less concerned that women in Lebanon or just cannot focus on the citizenship law. Of course, the citizenship law those issues have everything to do with the crises in these countries. They're not disconnected, but when bombs are raining on you, it's hard. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Can I respond? I completely agree. That's exactly my point. My point is that is exactly the point. The function of a feminist movement or a feminist ideology would be to make precisely the point that you've made, and to show the problem is that the activists now, because of this split that has occurred, as I see it, not everyone will agree with me on this, obviously, but as I see the split that has occurred, the activists are working, as I put it, under the radar. Let's not get into some of these very thorny issues, because it's just going to make us more enemies than we already have. And let's get this labor law changed and that law and the criminal code changed, and let's do this, and let's not go after the big things. Let's just leave those alone for the time being. It's not the moment. And of course, it is the job of that's exactly what I'm saying. It is the job of the feminist movement, or it would have been the job, to make the connection and show that this would be the way to strengthen the thing. But again, as things are happening, and the feminists, there are lots of feminists, of course, who are writing in Palestine and Lebanon and even in Iraq. But the difficulty is to get, if you are trying to be involved in the national struggle, it's hard at the same time to separate yourself from the mainstream, and that's I think one of the problems.
Can I just come in?
Yeah, please. Is your mic on?
No, I think it is there. That is true, but it need not be the case. I'm right now working on domestic violence in Turkey. I have a project on domestic violence, and Turkey went through a war in the Kurdish regions of the country in the east, and there was much violence, nationalist violence on the part of the Turks as well as the Kurds, and women who had been most victimized by this violence, state violence as well as Kurdish violence, Kurdish group of women, managed to come out of this war, creating this incredible association called Kamer. Right now they are in all the 23 provinces of Turkey, and in the western regions where feminist activism originally began. You don't have the same sort of organization fighting against domestic violence. It was this nationalist war and the kind of victimization that women went through that ignited and sparked these women who took leadership roles to create this incredible organization. It's really mind-boggling what these women who went through the war did. So I don't think we need to. I hear what you say. It might have been that way, but it need not have been that way. And sometimes nationalist wars and important national questions that do end up victimizing women might end up actually, prompting them to do something to resist the kind of, emancipating, power that is exerted over them. So it need not be the case. In other contexts, it hasn't been the case. In the western part of Turkey, the situation might have been more like what you said. But, in the east, we do have an incident at least.
I had a friend who was working with one of the women's organizations that fight for violence, domestic violence, and she told me that during last summer's Israeli invasion of Lebanon, there were 1 million refugees, 1 million, and some of them took refuge in a public garden, a lot of them in schools and things, and there were several incidents of men, just sort of going in the stress and the pressure of that time, striking their wives, and then people would come up and say, "You can't do this." The women's movement had a problem with this kind of thing. I mean, which kind of violence? I mean, it's all violence, right? I mean, but there's violence directed at everybody, and there's violence directed against women or children, and that's, of course, a very, it's part of the bigger struggle. Obviously, I agree with what you're saying completely. It's certainly part of it, and that's what they were trying to do. But there's a kind of irrelevance that grows up. I have another friend who was a psychoanalyst, and she was helping to train the volunteers who were helping the refugees in some of these receiving centers, like schools and things. And she was telling me that later, especially after the war ended and people went back to their villages or their homes and they were destroyed and they're living in tents, she said, some of the big organizations of like UNICEF, I don't know, I don't want to mention names because I don't know which, were coming to offer assistance for all of these things. And she was saying to me, what am I supposed to do with this stuff? And these people don't even have homes to live in, and they're living in tents. How can I help them in therapy, and they're traumatized, or they have problems with violence, or they have problems, domestic violence? I mean, they're living in tents. What are we supposed to do? So there's a kind of proportion that gets lost in the midst of things like that. That's all.
One final question.
The discussion is too exciting not to...
We'll have time for a discussion at the end, so don't worry.
No, I was going to bring the Egyptian experience into this because I think it's pretty valid for this particular discussion. What we found in Egypt is that the split comes down between the Islamists and between the secularists. This has become the big thing. And I think that from listening to this panel today, it's obvious that in every one of these countries there's some sort of a split or some sort of a fight, an infight between the different women's groups. And clearly what needs to be done, and I'm myself a professor, but I'm also an activist, and what needs to be done is to somehow overcome this and to somehow try, and we realize this in Egypt now, we're trying to work together. And I quote Amal Abdelhadi, who says, I'm a total secularist, but now I've learned to speak the language of Islam. So basically what is being done today is somehow trying to get the groups together. And the last conference we had, we were discussing what were the problems that faced all women. And actually there's 3 problems, and I think today the 3 problems came out. And the first of all had to do with personal status laws. The second had to do with work and the treatment of women and their jobs and all the problems that we know, the ceiling and so on, glass ceiling. And the third is domestic violence. And the 3 of them, and this is where in that one conference, the so-called Islamists and the so-called non-Islamists sat down and discussed it, and basically these came out to be the three main problems. I don't know. I'm just talking. How do we strategize? What do we do? These differences have to be closed in. Differences between the so-called scholars and the so-called activists. This is something we're always hit with. You just theorize. You cannot be part of it. Differences between people who talk, women who are Islamists, and most importantly is what was just being discussed, and that is the idea: can the national movement be more important than the women's movement? Because forever now, in the case of Egypt,
Every political party at every spot says we have a national cause. If it's not one war, it's the other war. The women fight it, and then they're put aside. Your problems can wait. There are bigger problems. And this is being said every single time. So where do we and then the whole idea of democratization. I mean, the vote and the. I'd like to suggest something else that we maybe, as activists, work towards, and that is participation. And I think the American experience from way back tells us this. That maybe if we begin to participate from the base, begin to start creating some sort of, I don't know, getting people from the base, especially in the countryside, to come to vote and to be part of this. The speaker for lunch was talking about this experience. I believe it was in Liberia. There are cases to be learned, but participation is everything. You participate at the school level, you participate in the village. It doesn't have to be just for Congress and the whole plan of democratization. I think Rolla's example is a very, very good one. So yeah, I just got very involved in this, and I just wanted to participate in it.
Thank you, Amira. I'm not going to let the panelists respond because we need to get back on track, but there will be time after the next panel for just an open discussion about the entire day. And